gives his life for what he believes. Every woman gives her life for what she believes. Sometimes people believe in little or nothing. Nevertheless, they give up their lives to that little or nothing. One life is all we have, and we live it as we believe in living it. And then, it's gone. But to surrender what you are and live without belief, that's more terrible than dying. More terrible than dying young.
The arrival of Jeanne d'Arc onto the earth plane and her subsequent adventures have left an unerasable mark in history books. One of the greatest remote viewers of all time, the image of Jeanne d'Arc, the legend, visionary and clairvoyant, has weaved its magic, transcending time itself. Her strength, courage, and compassion is recognized by protagonists, artists, musicians, and even freedom fighters. She is a symbol against oppression and injustice. But how did Jeanne d'Arc come to be? At the age of 13, she had her first vision of Saint Michael by the oak tree just outside Domremy. Was she to know the adventure she was about to embark upon? Did the veil that separates the two worlds suddenly and dramatically open fully to young Jeanne, leaving her isolated and standing with her 2 feet in both worlds simultaneously? And what secrets did she hold and subsequently take to the grave? Did she truly have the ear of God through channeling such revered saints, Michael, Margaret, and Catherine?
You are not alone.
Or was she just another visionary of her time, with intuition being her only guide?
The situation is
To unravel this mystery, we must be prepared to unlearn everything that popular history has insisted we believe. Only then, like a jigsaw puzzle, adding piece by piece, can we obtain a clearer picture, and by doing so, rebuild the true character of Jeanne d'Arc, the saint, the visionary, the legend.
So to understand the phenomena that is Jeanne d'Arc, the visionary, the clairvoyant, and how she came to be, we have to suspend almost everything that we know about her and unlearn everything that we know about her, because this story is far greater and far more intriguing than history documents. Her life is a psychological thriller. This is epic. It is in fact a prophecy of Merlin of more than 800 years prior to her birth that sets the stage for her arrival onto the earth plane, a stage that has transcended time itself, and her magic and her dance has weaved through the centuries and has stood thus far the test of time. This prophecy, that some say is legend or folklore, is very precise in its wording, that France would be lost by a woman, that woman in question being Isabel of Bavaria, and would be saved by a virgin or a maid that lives on the borders of Lorraine and whose home could see the oakwood forest. And Jeanne would have been very much aware of this folklore, this prophecy of Merlin, or this legend. And she would have known that she lived on the borders of Lorraine. She would have known that she's a virgin, and she would have known that she could see the oakwood forest from her home. So in many ways, Jeanne at this early age was preparing herself for the forthcoming journey. The 2 years in which she made some very prophetic prophecies in her very short lifespan of approximately 19 years will prove without a shadow of a doubt that her arrival onto the earth plane was in fact perfect divine timing. It's important to understand that linear time in which this 800-year-old prophecy is presented to us is an illusion. Time and space are inseparable, and they are multidimensional. And this 800-year-old prophecy only exists because we make it exist. This prophecy has been downloaded generation after generation, year after year, decade after decade, and century after century, making a massive field of information. And as this information grows, what we now understand is there's a lot of genetic inheritance, so people would have had this information embedded into them before they come onto the earth plane also. And it only took a recipient, and in this case being Jeanne d'Arc, to transcend that energy into reality. And as anybody who has had a near-death experience will tell you, that absolutely Jeanne d'Arc, prior her coming to the earth plane, would have chosen this task in order for this prophecy to be fulfilled, in much the same way that prior to Judas come to the earth plane in order to portray Christ so that his prophecy could be fulfilled, it would have had to have been agreed in the spirit world.
Dr. Linda Kramer was clinically dead for 14 minutes. She is a near-death experience survivor and author of the book 5 Years in Heaven. She offers us some explanations on the time conundrum.
I thoroughly believe there is no time. Time is only a concept that we have on this planet due to our own planet revolving around the sun. So therefore, one rotation is a day, and minutes, hours are a calculation of that process as a circular around the sun. When we go into the universe, as soon as we're outside of this concept of earthly time, we find that there is no time. Time does not exist. So therefore, I have a few theories about Jeanne being, I would call, prophesized to be here 800 years before her birth. One, it could be that a being outside of our earthly plane has that knowledge of all knowing due to there being no time. So therefore, everything is concurrent. Everything, whether it's from 2000 BC, the year 1428, or now in 2023, everything is actually happening at the same moment. Therefore, Jeanne's prophecy of becoming 800 years after the prophecy can simply be explained as it was concurrent in the knowledge of the person who announced it. But then we also go deeper into our soul being, where our souls are all knowing, and we do sign up for life lessons and life contracts. And therefore, in that theory of a life contract, how do we know that it wasn't a soul who knew that 800 years later they themselves would inhabit the body of Joan of Arc, and then they professed her coming because they were her?
Has history documented Jeanne d'Arc incorrectly? The romantic notion that a peasant girl from a small village just outside of France, a girl that could neither read nor write, somehow miraculously led an army to victory, and by doing so put into motion the end of the 100-year war that united France. To understand the phenomena of Jeanne d'Arc, a story in fact far more romantic and far more intriguing than the popular story told, we must first understand Jeanne the girl. And who exactly were her mother and father? What was their role in their daughter's calling, of whom we know so little?
The name d'Arc didn't exist. There was no apostrophe in 15th century France. In Italy at the time it was coming in, but in France it wasn't the case. And so her name was probably Darch, Dars, Das, Tarch, even Darx with an X. It's a derivative of her father's name, Jacques, who actually we're not really even sure if that is his real name. It could be Jacob or Jacques. So what we do know is that Jeanne actually said in one of the public examinations that she did not know her family name. And it was only later on in I think the 5th public examination that she said her name was Jeanne d'Arc. But this is most likely because she was told that's what it was. But the transcripts also say that she did not know her family name. The idea of Jeanne d'Arc is some romantic notion, Jeanne of the bow. But Jeanne was a warrior. She wasn't a foot soldier who used a bow and arrow. Her sword was quite important to her. And in fact, one of her prophecies talks of where her sword could be found, buried deep behind the altar of the church of St. Catherine de Fibrois, a church that she had never been to prior to that sword being found there. She actually sent somebody to go and get it. So as you can see, at this fundamental level, there are some big misrepresentations of Jeanne, her name, her position, and exactly who her family was.
The popular history books record Jacques d'Arc as being a poor peasant farmer, barely able to keep a roof over his head, and needed the assistance of his children, including young Jean, to work the land, herding sheep and cattle in between their duties at home with their mother, Isabelle Romée. But are these records accurate? Is there more to Jacques d'Arc than history records so little about? What influence did family life have over young Jean? And furthermore, who exactly was her mother, Isabelle Romée?
We know that actually the d'Arc family were not peasants. And this is important to understand because Jeanne's perception in life would have been based around her basic understanding of life and everything that was enveloped around that life. Jacques d'Arc owned 21 hectares of land. And to give you some perspective, that's about the equivalent of 75 soccer pitches. You don't get to own that amount of land if you're a peasant. The d'Arc family were effectively low-grade nobles called vavasseurs or vassals. And Jacques d'Arc was appointed dean of the village of Domremy. And part of his duties were administrative and military duties. He would also have had to have taken the collected taxes to Robert de Baudricourt of Vaucouleurs. And so it's inconceivable that Jeanne would not have gone with him from time to time
When we arrive at the
on
abbey,
this journey.
you must remember your manners.
Can you
around
imagine the
lords and
conversation
bishops.
between father and daughter on this
Yes,
journey?
Papa.
However,
Only speak when you are asked
it's
to
also clear
Yes, Papa.
that she would have learned the language of nobility and chivalry. Her father would have taught her how she should approach the aristocratic society, if you will. And it's most likely that Jeanne would have learnt her military prowess from her father, because she also admitted that she would have had to, on the occasion, knowing that there's an invading army come, bring the cattle and the livestock and the villagers to a safe place. It's again inconceivable that she couldn't ride a horse. She would have had to have known how to have ridden a horse. And so none of these duties that Jacques d'Arc had would have been given to a peasant. We also believe that they owned the only stone building in the village, which still exists today, but has been developed and has got another story. At the time, it had a ground floor and a loft. And so Jeanne would also have known her position in the family here. She would have known her position in society and would have known that they are a little bit higher up than the peasants in the village or the ordinary folk. So she would have used her astute mind in this way when meeting aristocracy, to control, direct and manipulate. After all, she was a visionary and she heard the voice of angels directing her.
Medieval historian Professor Anne Lester at Johns Hopkins University explains one of the few ways women in Middle Europe could gain public status and a level of public notice was through religious means. Is it possible that Jeanne d'Arc could have been seen as a divine messenger and more readily accepted as such?
This practice of prophecy or mysticism, the idea that women are receiving voices from God or from the saints and are the conduit of those voices, was absolutely a way that women could find and create a kind of legitimate space for their own expression of ideas. Because in a way, they are subsuming their own ideas and giving them over to, again, the voice of God or of the saints. So I think it's, again, a very kind of clever way of going about this, but there's also a long tradition that this is a way to legitimate sort of women's agency and voice. Now, that said, I also think Joan of Arc did truly believe she was receiving these visions and voices. So, we need to respect her own sense of religion and her role in that, as was true, I think, of many other religious women. There is a long tradition, and Joan is a part of this, of women, female mystics, having a significant amount of authority, and I think people in particular respecting and responding to the kinds of messages they put forward. And I think one of the reasons for this is sometimes the fact that they were young and they were seen as particularly pure if they sort of professed or went into the religious life from very early on. But I think another reason is that so much of Christian prophecy in its legitimate form is grounded in the idea that a prophet would be humble or would make themselves Christ-like. And within the social status of medieval Europe, there are very few positions that are more humble than a peasant girl, right? Sure. And so, you couldn't, in a way, have less power. So that makes her a kind of ideal receptacle or recipient of divine revelation, in that sense, that God will choose the more humble person to speak to or speak through. And so I think this idea was understood and cultivated in various ways, and it made sense to people that that she would be somebody in that humble form to receive this kind of information. We can see other parallels. There are male mystics and prophets, but they're often, again, men of lower origin or humble conversi, we might say. They're sort of part of a religious order, but they're not always abbots or monks or bishops. Rarely do you see people like that at that kind of status. So I think humility is important. Yeah.
Isabella would have taken much time to educate her children. Isabella would have been responsible for teaching Jeanne the Pater Noster, the Hail Mary, and all the duties around the house. She would have taught Jeanne how to sew and spin. And in fact, it's here we get a glimpse of Jeanne's personality here, as in the trials when they questioned her on what was her duties while she was at home. She said, "I learnt to spin and sew, and in Rouen I fear nobody when it comes to spinning and sewing." So from this we learn, at a very earthly project, her competitiveness, her determination, and her willingness to be the best. And this story that she was a herder of sheep and cattle is absolutely incorrect, because in the trial, as is written in the transcript, she says, "When I was at home with my father, I employed myself with the ordinary duties of home. I never went into the field with the animals." And this is a complete turnaround now of the mainstream story that tells us she was a herder of sheep and cattle. So already we can see that far from being a peasant girl, she is the daughter of her mother and father of some substance, of very low nobility. She would have had some kind of education in military simply by talking to her father. She would have known how to speak with nobility and would have known chivalry. Jeanne d'Arc was not an ordinary medieval peasant girl.
I think another reason why she's often framed as a sort of lesser status and kind of marginal is because that region that she comes from in the east, the Vosges, not too far from Metz, was not central France. So in a way to try and integrate her story and her family, I think there is almost a kind of metaphor in the sense that they're not as well connected, but they are not of purely peasant stock. I think also those comments in her deposition about how she spends her time, we also need to remember that France had been at war with England for decades by this point. They are desperate, and the majority of the 100 Years' War, of course, is fought on French soil all through that territory. The landscape had been devastated, and it would have been extremely unsafe for a girl to have been out on her own tending the sheep. And she's sort of, I think she and her family are very much aware of that. So she wants to also, I think, make those points clear. We need to remember sort of the context in which her words are being put forward. In particular, in medieval Europe, sort of what her class structure was, if she's a part of the nobility, if she's a part of the peasantry, if she's free or unfree, if she's part of the urban bourgeoisie, that determines many different aspects of her role in society. I think across the board, one of the most important roles that all women would have played is roles within the family. At the noble level, that meant that women and the lands and properties attached to them, either because they inherited them or because of marriage, those holdings would pass to their heirs. And in an attempt to keep those land holdings together was incredibly important for most noble families. And women played a key role in the structure and coherence of those families. Similarly, among the urban bourgeoisie, women would have played a significant role in running businesses, overseeing certain aspects of production, and the way in which the household functioned as a whole unit, but in particular an economic and social unit. Even if they didn't have legal status to plead their cases or be represented in documentation, they would have had a fundamental role in making that whole system work. And of course, among the peasantry, both free and unfree, women did a tremendous amount of labor, particularly we know in terms of cloth production for this whole period of time, and within, agricultural work in the fields. So with respect to Joan of Arc, we know that some of the background of her own family, both in pastoral work, but also in just the daily labor of keeping a farm running and the kinds of structures and relationships she'd have with lords or people over her and her family would have.
Her virginity and her cleanliness, as they called it, would have stood her in good stead. They'd often say that Jeanne never had the secret illness that women had. And so this gave her more power with her visions, because at the time it was believed that the devil could have no commerce with a virgin. So her voices were quite acceptable to even the church. It only became unacceptable if the church could prove that those saintly voices were demonic.
Yeah, I think exactly. The 15th century here, we're right on the cusp of a significant transition in terms of the sort of treatment and, prosecution, if you will, of women visionaries, either as heretics or as witches. Witches will become a much more common accusation by the later 15th and 16th century. In the earlier period, being brought up on charges of heresy is still, I think, a real both fear and reality for women and for the kinds of individuals like bishops who they will encounter. And so, Joan is her whole situation takes place right at this moment of change. She's not really accused of being a witch per se, but there are questions about the nature of the voices she hears, and is this diabolical, the role of the devil, or is it heretical? Is she actually hearing someone else or having these own ideas herself? And so I think thinking about those distinctions is important, because that determines the ways in which bishops or tribunals will come up with particular charges and talk to women about the kinds of authority that they claim. What was absolutely not allowed to women throughout this period, from the apostolic period forward, really, is to preach. And so you could talk about the visions and voices you hear. You could be that conduit, but you couldn't relate your own ideas or interpret the Bible yourself. Women are constantly brought up for accusations of either preaching or heretical thought and public speaking in that sense. To be a mystic, and as Joan does, to really locate the voices as coming not from her, but from God, was a way to work around and through some of those concerns.
800 years after the prophecy of the coming of Jeanne d'Arc was first announced, her raison d'être begins its journey. Her mission, as stated by her voices, had 4 clear and historically important objectives.
Firstly, to raise the Siege of Orléans. The city was besieged for 7 months prior to Jeanne's arrival on April 29th, 1429. 7 months later, the prophecy was fulfilled. The second prophetic responsibility was to get the release of the Duke of Orléans, who fell into the hands of the English at the disastrous campaign in Agincourt in 1415. Her actions eventually got him released, but some 9 years after her death. The third prophetic responsibility was to drive out the English from France.
You Englishmen, who have no right in this kingdom of France, the King of Heaven sends you word and warning by me, Jeanne the Maid, to abandon your forts and depart into your own country, or I will raise such a war cry against you as shall be remembered forever. And this I write to you for a third and last time, nor shall I write further.
And despite all of her extraordinary achievements, Jeanne unfortunately never lived to see the day when this happens, as she was brutally executed prior to this. At the trial of condemnation, she stated that England would lose far more than the defeat at Orléans and would actually be thrown out of France before 7 years have passed. Save those that die here. And Parisian historians recognise the defeat of England and the end of their stay in France 6 years and 8 months after the defeat of Orléans. The fourth prophetic responsibility was to anoint Charles king at Rheims. He was to be crowned King of France in March. This was the prophecy. And this prophecy was verified in a letter written in April 1429.
Tomorrow the blood will flow from my body, above the breast.
How could she know the exact place the arrow would pierce her body? And on this same day, she predicted against all probability that the triumphant army would enter into Orléans over the bridge, which at that time was broken down.
I loved that sword because it was found in the church of Saint Catherine, whom I loved.
She described in detail the location and appearance of a sword in the chapel of Saint Catherine de Fierbois. It was found buried, and the blade was so covered in rust, it would have been impossible for her to describe it without having seen it before. Jeanne was warned by her guides that she would be wounded by an arrow at the attack of Touraine, 7th of May, 1429.
I will only be with you for 1 year. It is needful then that you use me to the full.
Come closer. Do not be afraid.
So here we witness precise wording. And even when there's uncertainty, she states that uncertainty very clear, making it sure that she cannot be misrepresented or misunderstood. Jeanne, in her 15th century frame of mind, understood the power of words, and she stood before, always in these public examinations, in front of over 40 people, and she never mixed her words. It was very clear that her faith in God, her visions and her voices was absolutely unshakable. Once again, we hear the power of words coming from Jeanne's lips. I do not accept your prohibition. And when they question her again on her wishing to escape, she says, it's true. I do wish to escape and still do. Is it not lawful for all prisoners? And this statement actually tells us that she understands at some level law, because she could have said, isn't it my right, or wouldn't you do so? But Jeanne is very specific. She's very clear, and she only uses words that she means. And in this case, she knew that it was lawful for prisoners to have the desire to escape.
Again, this speaks to the fact that women may not have had formal legal training or the ability to stand in front of a court and present stories, but they absolutely understood how to plead, how to tell a story, how the system worked, because they observed, they talked about it. We know they strategized with male relatives who would go to court. So I think, she's an example of a kind of woman who would have this sort of understanding. And I think she's part of a continuum in this sense, in terms of going before a tribunal and displaying a kind of legal know-how that we'll also see when someone like the historian Natalie Zeman Davis, who wrote the wonderful wonderful book, The Return of Martin Guerre, will display the kinds of lay legal knowledge that people of this class would have had just by virtue of hearing and watching and seeing how generations of neighbors had interacted in front of royal officials or ecclesiastical tribunals and thought of themselves in relation to power, really. And that's a lot of what we see here.
And so once again, they wish her to take an oath. And she says, I made an oath to you yesterday. That should be sufficient. You overburden me with this. So now they question her about her revelations, and they asked her, when you saw the king, was there light around him? And she very, very abruptly refuses to answer this. Pass on, she says, pass on. And they ask her again, did you know by revelation about your mission with the king? And she says, you will not hear this from me. The king had many apparitions and beautiful revelations before he set me to work.
You are a harlot and a beast.
And you, sir?
And again, they question her about the oath, of which she says, you may surely do without this. I have sworn enough already. And she says it in a very, very powerful way. They go on to question her about revelation and did her voices forbid her to say anything regarding this matter, to which she says, I will not answer you about that. She's very, very clear about this. I have revelations touching the king that I shall not answer you. It's very specific. I shall not answer you. And so they question her further. Has it forbidden you to tell these revelations? She says, I will tell you no more, but give me a delay of 15 days and I will answer you. So what does this imply? To me, it's clear that she's waiting advice from her council, and she will not put herself in any more peril than what she's in at the moment, because she knows if she has her council given her the okay to say this, she knows that she'll be protected. Of course, they didn't give her 15 days because the last thing they wanted is for her to give an answer that cuts off another line of questioning. Again, they question her about her voices, and she says, I will not tell you everything. This voice is good and worthy, and I am not bound to answer you. And here she really begins to get some quick fire answers. And again, they're very, very, very clear and cuts off this line of questioning where they ask her, do you believe you're in a state of sin? To which she replies, I believe I would not see my visions if I were. So then they question her further, trying to trick her and ask her, therefore you believe to be in a state of grace. To which she readily replies without any hesitation, if I am not, may God put me there. If I am, may he keep me there.
I think she clearly, whether through her mother or mother and father and other, people within her world in growing up, has a very clear and sharp understanding of what we might call kind of practical theology. She never hesitates in answering those kinds of questions. What did they look like? How did they sound? When did they speak to you? And there isn't, at least in the record we get, hesitance or confusion there. So those are the kinds of, in a way, things that you can imagine a young girl or woman thinking through carefully, wanting to understand who's talking to her and having a kind of conviction about this. Now, I think in addition, in order to understand the whole process of her trial, the way that she's able to essentially hold herself and stick to her conviction through all of that, and we know eventually under torture, I think she as a person also had a tremendous amount of personal charisma and self-mastery is sort of the only way I can think about, to be able to go in front of the king, to present this idea, to put forward a case that she should be at the head of the French army, to lead them to a series of victories. I mean, the religious question aside, we are dealing with a remarkable individual. I think even if some of our source base, for various reasons, may cast her that way, and the English and the French both have an interest in suggesting she was unique and unusual, I think you can't do that for every person. There is something distinctive about her, and that's why she's able in part to accomplish what she accomplishes.
That we should have nothing further to do with her.
So they continue this line of questioning about her visions, and they ask her, how did she see St. Michael and the angels? To which she very readily replies, I see them as readily as I see you. They continue now changing the subject, going backwards and forwards, trying to confuse her, trying to trick her. And in this case, they ask her, did it please God that you dressed as a man? And she said, all that I have said and done comes through God. Do you ask me to transgress his wish? And so again, on her voices, do your voices give you counsel? To which she replies, on some points, yes. But she says, there are things I cannot tell you because I do not have leave to do so. I do not have the protection of warrant. In other words, what she's saying is that she will not tell you everything unless she has the protection of her voices, of her visions. She needs the counsel of her saints before she will respond.
Silence! I am your judge, lest you have forgotten.
The English will have a greater loss in France than they've ever had. She goes on to say, before 7 years have passed, England will be kicked out of France, save for those who die there. And they ask her, how do you know this? And she says, by revelation, of course. She's very clear about this. And actually, you must understand that in 15th century France, it wasn't illegal or it wasn't heresy to hear voices. It was only a problem if those voices were proven to be demonic or less than holy. But she says, I know them by revelation. And what's really great about this line is that she says, and I am sore vexed that it will take so long. And this tells us that she is absolutely clear, she's absolutely convinced of the message that she received was that the English will be kicked out of France within 7 years. And she says to them to really stress the point, and I know this as clear as I am seeing you standing before me in the moment. And actually historians all agree that it was the raising of the Siege of Orléans that was the beginning of the end for the English campaign in France, and that 6 years and 8 months after that siege, England, their campaign was finished. They were done in France. And so they continue their line of questioning. When will this happen? To which she replies very quickly, I do not know the hour of the day. Well, which year will this happen? And she says quite clearly, I will answer you no more. And now they change the subject again to try and throw her off guard very quickly, twisting and turning with their questions to trick her. And they ask her, your saints, when they came to you, did they have hair? It is well to know they have, she says, very profound, very quick. Does Saint Margaret speak English to you? Of which almost sarcastically she replies, why should she speak English when she's not on the English side? And so then they question her again about St. Michael. Does he wear clothes? Did he come to you naked? To which she replies very cleverly, is God so poor that he cannot afford to clothe them?
there are a series of very complicated jurisdictional questions when they decide how the trial should go forward. And choosing to put her in front of a tribunal of bishops based out of Paris was in many ways following a kind of ecclesiastical precedent or procedure that we know had happened earlier in the later 13th and throughout the 14th century with other women. A good example would be Margaret Porete, who had written a book and was a kind of mystic. In the end, she's condemned for what is considered as to be a heretical book, and she and the book were burnt at the stake in 1310. So that's just one example, but there are other examples of women who kind of fit into the mold that the ecclesiastical establishment is trying to kind of examine Joan within. But then there are a whole other set of jurisdictions, as you say, in terms of baronial courts and royal courts where her case could have been heard and would have maybe had a different outcome in that sense. I think we're dealing with such an exceptional moment during the 100 Years' War where the English are in control and they then choose the tribunal in which she's going to be tried. And then when the French are victorious again, they retry her case, and after she's dead, come out with a very different outcome. So in this sense, we get a unique kind of view into how the two sides would and did construct a version of Joan of Arc through the sources.
You are relapsed, and for this reason you shall burn.
Would Jeanne d'Arc have felt pain on the funeral pyre?
Hold the cross up high.
Most certainly,
that I might
she
see
would
it
have
through the
died of smoke
flames.
inhalation before suffering the pains of burning. But could a highly evolved soul such as she been able to raise her consciousness or have elevated awareness to that of beyond pain? Was she capable of entering a trance state to bypass any physical sensations? Or would she have been taken from her body long before she would have suffered smoke inhalation? Dr. Linda Kramer explains the process of dying.
The day I had my car accident, I exited the vehicle before impact because of intervention from an unknown being who was with me in the car. So we look at people who are about to become deceased. Let's just go there in history with the Tudor Empire of England and how many people were beheaded. So as that person who's about to be executed goes up to the block and they bend over to have their head chopped off with the axe or sword, there is a high possibility that they do leave their body first just prior to that pain occurring, because they know it was predestined, so they take that out, like sub-clause out before the actual event occurred. So yes, I thoroughly believe the answer is yes. We can exit our body just prior to very traumatic events occurring that were predestined in our lives.
Michael Funovic is a Qigong master and energy worker. He offers us his explanation on how Jeanne may have been able to raise her awareness to that of above pain.
It may be possible that due to this very strong belief of Jeanne d'Arc, that she had easy access to this ability of dissociation, so that also the mind leaves the body before she feels the pain of getting burnt. And it is also possible due to the strong belief system that her ability of meditation is that advanced even with knowing any particular techniques, so that also when getting burnt her brain might have operated on theta wave level, so the pain of getting burnt did not affect her at all. There may be two possibilities. First, the mind leaves the body before the heating is so strong, so the monk would not feel any pain as its mind is already gone. Second possibility, the monk is in such deep meditation, so his brain is already operating on theta wave level, so the pain does not affect him at all. But for this, there are much more scientific studies as to biofeedback methods conducted by Elmer Green that may have some more space for research how this can be happen. Although walking on coals seems to be easier than, for instance, getting burned, as many people do that successfully, also due to just physical reasons, the coal is not that hot and so on. But of course, some mentally and physically preparation is quite useful and even necessary. But when you have really the heart to do so, then all these things may be possible, as we see. Jeanne d'Arc was not a Qigong master. Qigong probably was not known in Europe of the 15th century, and there's also no evidence that Jeanne d'Arc practiced Qigong, but she may have been a Kung Fu master, as this term not only refers to martial arts, but any kind of arts or regular practice that you do and you reach mastery. So, Jeanne d'Arc definitely reached master's level in that what she was doing, so I would call her a Kung Fu master.
So we know that Jeanne d'Arc did not come from a peasant family. She was the daughter of modestly wealthy landowners, low-grade nobles called vavasseurs or vassals. We know that she never worked the land, although she did say that she may have gone into the pasture and just looked after the animals for a period of time while her father went off and done something else. She spent her time with her mother, learning to spin and sew, learning prayers, and so on and so forth. But after her brutal execution, Jacques d'Arc, his death is attributed to the immense grief that he felt over the loss of his daughter. While Isabella Romy, or Isabella de Vouton, spent the rest of her life campaigning to get her daughter's name restored. King Charles gave the d'Arc family full nobility with a coat of arms, and Isabelle went to Orléans, where she spent the rest of her days, the place where Jeanne said that she wished to live. She was given a pension and became ill and was looked after 24/7. She died at the very old age at that time of 74. I'd like to read the testimony that Isabella gave at her daughter's trial of rehabilitation or trial of nullification, because from here we will certainly learn or understand how Jeanne was able to answer her accusers with such potency, with such accuracy, with such forthrightness, how she was able to speak with so much authority to the higher echelons of society. She would have spent much time with her mother, who certainly would have educated her in these ways. And it would be very clear that her mother was no ordinary farmer's wife, because this testimony is eloquent, articulate, passionate, and forthright, and actually would be the envy of many writers today. And so this testimony goes like this.
Jeannette was my daughter, born to a lawful Catholic family, and raised among meadows and fields. I had her receive the holy sacraments of baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist, raising her in fear of God and teaching her the rich traditions of the Church according to her age and circumstance. Jeannette devoted much of her time in church, whereupon, having made her confession, she would receive every month the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist. She would fast with grace and dignity on those prescribed holy days of obligation without wavering, and offered up petitions with great devotion and passion for all those suffering in these uncertain times. But even then, though Jeannette never did say or contemplate anything contrary to the faith, her enemies, in defiance of the Lord under whom she served, brought an illegitimate lawsuit against her in matters of faith.
The evidence is all there. We just need to present it.
They held no regard for her refusals, tacit or expressed appeals. Neither did my daughter receive counsel to defend her innocence. They imputed false crimes to her, and to the perdition of their souls, they cruelly reduced her body to ashes in the flames of a pyre, in the midst of a tearful crowd, and finally inflicted on her, as well as on me, Isabel, her mother, and her entire family, irreparable damage and a stain of infamy. Today, as our Holy Father, the Pope, defender of truth and supporter of the oppressed, has kindly granted me a hearing, I come here to voice my long-held grievances. I come here to demand justice. I come here to reclaim the good name of my daughter. Jeanne is the Pied Piper, and we dance to her tune. We have danced her dance down through the ages, and her melody still plays on. She joins us in the dance, filling our souls with love, compassion, and above all else, courage. Her story is our story. Her strength, courage, and compassion is now deeply entwined within the vibration of the collective minds of all people on Mother Earth. We have become one with Jeanne, and by doing so, we no longer can tell the dancer from the dance. Who is Jeanne d'Arc? I am Jeanne d'Arc. You are Jeanne d'Arc. We are all Jeanne d'Arc.